I love getting predatory journal emails. They're like, do you want to join the comparative zoology journal? And you're like, what out of my one work ever made you think I'm doing zoology? Mind-boggling.
I get a lot of weird ones because of the medical publications I've done.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, just all these invitations. Hey, have you done any clinical studies recently? Publish it real fast.
Ugh.
Publish it real fast. Things you don't want to hear with a medical
Right.
journal. Well, I tested this medicine on one person and he did not die.
Oh,
Please
that's called
take
a
my
case study.
golly.
Well, well, I'm thinking that we do a makeshift different topic. How about shark? What?
Uh, uh,
How about sharks versus mosasaurs? Because we've got mosasaur and shark people in here.
All
Like we
right.
already got what bite traces on
I
like
mean,
mosasaurs from Cretaceous, so there
I
goes
think it
Pretty
that.
sure there's
depends
some
on
small
what
Corax bites too.
Yeah.
shark we're talking about, you know?
Well, we're
In
we're
which
going to talk
mosasaur?
about like the adaptations of different ones. We'll talk about the fossils when they appear in the fossil record, all of that, their demise.
Hmm.
All right. So sharks appeared, what, Ordovician or something?
Well, the true
Silurian?
sharks appeared. They
So
appeared in the Permian. So the Ordovician, you had your first scales.
Ah, okay. So they had a little bit of a head start.
Oh, we
Yeah.
Yeah,
only a
because
smidge.
mosasaurs, they appear, give or take, Cenomanian, Turonian,
yeah.
Mhm.
90 million years-ish.
And they
And
rip
when
off
did
every other reptile before that became secondarily aquatic.
and when
It's
did
nasty.
or where did mosasaurs come from as far as their evolutionary background?
Ah, boy. You want to get in an argument?
Yeah, let's do it.
Uh,
Aren't there things like we got Dallosaurus, but I'm sure there's things
yeah.
older than
Oh,
Dallosaurus.
I thought he was getting at, like, is it snake versus lizard?
Ah, okay. Like
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
small
yeah. We
that would
want to
be a
hear
fun
that.
topic.
It goes back and forth, and it all just depends on how you code the characters.
Hmm.
Every 2 years it changes, depending on who's
But
writing the paper.
but snakes are just legless lizards. I mean,
Mhm.
I thought
the
they're
Ah.
just
box.
bony worms, scaly, bitey worms.
Angy worms.
Let's see. Yeah, but going back to the early mosasauroids, ids, yeah, Dallosaurus was definitely one of the early ones. That's Texas. You got Tethyosaurus in Morocco from around the same time.
hmm
Hmm.
And do we have any transitional fossils that would have been more lizard-like, but with mosasaur characteristics?
No,
Kind
that's
of
why
like
they're fighting.
Pachycetus?
Oh, that's
That,
dumb.
that
That's
that's the
unfortunate.
reason why there's so much argument. We don't have that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's a
Hmm.
shame.
That is a shame.
Well, the bias of the fossil record.
Yeah, so the true sharks, they would have been in the Permian. You had Synecdoche back then. Whether it actually is a true Synecdoche, that's probably up for debate. Not that many people are actually debating it, but Synecdoche is such a broad order or such a broad genus at this point that there's probably lots of different things lumped in with it. But as far as the sharks of the Cretaceous that would have competed with mosasaurs, you're mostly looking at lamniforms.
Yeah.
Lamniforms were from the Jurassic onwards, but we only know of these more benthic, more like um more flattened. They're not like that spindle shape that we mostly see today with lamniforms. It was Paleocarcharias. The key attribute that we link them to lamniforms is that they have an osteodont tooth design, which for people that don't know, that means that their crown is basically filled with this osteodentine. There's no pulp cavity or anything. And this is a trait that we know as of right now within the true sharks as exclusively within lamniforms. So that's where we linked that. But they really didn't become super predators or anything until the Cretaceous.
Hmm.
And the earliest super predator, the earliest macropredatory lamniforms wouldn't have competed with mosasaurs. They would have competed with like pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs because mosasaurs were kind of like a newcomer. In you said the Cenomanian, Turonian,
Hmm.
that's when they really took off.
Right.
Whereas you see like large cardobiodontids in the Albion, you have you have like Peraesaurus from there. You would have early Cretaceous, things like that.
Do we have any sharks in like the late Triassic? Because I know you get these giant ichthyosaurs by the end of
Yeah.
the late Triassic.
Yeah. So in
Mhm.
the Triassic, you would have, like I said before, this Synecodus, those lived on into the Triassic too. And you'd have the Synecodoniforms, which were the primary group of sharks at that time. You'd also have these weird offshoots where we can't quite place them yet on the phylogenetic tree, so they're kind of enigmatic. You have like Duffin Salaci, you have Raphia minuta, just all these weird ones that we believe that they're sharks because of their tooth morphology. Some of them have the triple layered enameloid, which is a debated topic in of itself, whether it's actually like a triple layered enameloid or not. But anyways, that's considered another synapomorphy among the true sharks. So you'd have some of those that we can't quite place around, but the sharks that we know today, we don't really know of any that were earlier than the early Jurassic. They were
Hmm.
probably around, but we just haven't found those fossils, considering that in the early Jurassic, we have like Erectolobiforms already, we have Hexanchoforms, we have a bunch of different stuff. So they probably did originate in the Triassic.
Sounds like sharks basically lived, at least in most of the Mesozoic, in the shadow of all these marine reptiles, pretty much.
Yeah,
They did, yeah. I
and it
mean,
wasn't really until the
ichthyosaurs, what?
that was like I say, it's really wasn't until the late Cretaceous that things started to get bigger and started to compete.
Yeah, especially in the shark world, because you had, like you said, you had massive ichthyosaurs that were really diverse too in
Yeah,
the Triassic. Even within the early Triassic, you had some, interesting ichthyosaurs. In the Jurassic, pliosaurs were the king, basically.
right.
And then in the Cretaceous, things kind of turn around for those groups. You'd have the pliosaurs eventually waning away. You had ichthyosaurs waning away, and sharks kind of really took over, but only until mosasaurs came around. And mosasaurs really turned things upside down, I feel like, for sharks.
So
I know
one question
this.
I have, just around the time the pliosaurs die out, which would be
Mhm.
Cenomanian-ish, do you
Yeah.
see a decrease in shark diversity that coincides with that?
Let's see. I believe that during that time when mosasaurs or when pliosaurs died out, I believe that we actually saw an increase, especially with the large macropredatory sharks. Because, for example, shortly after those died out, you'd have these monstrous Cretoxyrhino teeth. You did see Cardobiodon and Duardius kind of fall off around the Turonian or so.
Those are, I know Cretoxyrhina, Cardobiodon, and so on. Those are Coniacian, I want to say, right?
Um, I believe Cretaxyrhino
Or
existed
Santonian,
then.
Coniacian,
Yeah, it's like
Santonian.
Yeah,
Antonian.
but I don't believe that at least described Cardobiodon or Duardius have been around from there. In fact, I think that Dwardius may have become extinct in the Cenomanian. I don't know if those lived through the Turonian.
Well, because I know for marine reptiles, what happens is you see the decline in the pliosaurs and some of the plesiosaurs in right around the just before the Cenomanian, where there's a steep decline, and then that's where the mosasaurs just start getting started going into the water, and then afterwards, the mosasaurs diversify, the sharks diversify, and then there's another crash about halfway through. You see another turnover right around the mid-Campanian in the mosasaur fauna and probably the shark fauna, because you
Mhm.
don't see Cretoxyrhina get past the Campanian.
Yeah. Another one that died off in the Campanian is Tychodus, and that was an
Mm,
extremely prevalent genus within the Cretaceous. I
yeah.
mean, you find those teeth everywhere.
Yeah.
Chase, you find a lot of them in Mississippi and Alabama.
Yeah, but it's like once they hit the like earliest Campanian in at least locally, they just disappear. It's interesting.
And that
Yeah.
coincides with right after the Campanian, you start seeing Globidens appear.
Yeah, which means that mosasaurs were able to fill in a lot of different niches and even likely either outcompete or take over the niches that sharks have left behind.
Right. Yeah.
And you see that too in the, especially like the Maastrichtian, when you have those monster mosasaurs like Mosasaurus hoffmanni, you really don't see the same macropredatory sharks as you saw before. Like when Cretoxyrhina fell, Cardobiodon fell out, Cretotus, you really only had some large Scapanorhynchus. You had some, massive Squalocorax teeth from Morocco,
Yeah.
but for the most part, Squalocorax wasn't, filling up the niche of Cretoxyrhina. So you really had mosasaurs becoming the top dog in the late Cretaceous.
Yeah. And I don't think any mosasaur, or I'm sorry, any shark would have gotten about the size of a mosasaur. I mean, these things would have gotten 40, 50 feet long. These things are just
Mhm.
massive, depending on what species you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
not the size of the
suspect.
large mosasaurs. There were a lot of small mosasaurs out there, though.
Yeah. I
Right.
suspect that there would have been some pretty large sharks in the Cretaceous because some of them have what we consider their like small tooth genera, like Cardobiodon. If you compare their tooth size compared to their vertebrae size, their vertebrae are much larger than the teeth in proportion to like a modern day great white, where they had
Mhm.
large teeth in comparison with their vertebrae. Which means that for a tooth of the same size as a great white tooth, it would have came from a much larger shark. And you would have had a um, eventually what happens is the tooth size, they get larger and they reduce the number of teeth within the jaw. So they wind up scaling up. So back in the Cretaceous with like Cretaxyrhina and Cardobiodon, there was more tooth positions of these smaller teeth related to their vertebrae. But I've seen personally a over 3 inch Cretaxyrhina tooth being pulled out of Kansas, which that, considering it's a small tooth genus, would have been a monstrous animal. I mean, it may not have rivaled the size of the largest Mosasaurus hoffmanni, but it's still that was a no joke animal from the Cretaceous.
Wait, 3 inches
Yeah, I
for
believe it's in the
Cretoxyrhina?
Sternberg Museum now. I'm not entirely sure.
That kind of
Because
gets me
I rarely
thinking.
see those over 2 inches.
Yeah.
It
Do
was
we
a
have
monster
any of
tooth.
the growth and the teeth? Like, do we have enough sample sizes within Cretoxyrhina to show, what the growth rate would have been?
I'm not entirely sure. We have articulated specimens, I believe, of Cretoxyrhina, so that would be an interesting thing to study. I would need to look more into that.
No, I'm still stunned by the 3 inch tooth size because virtually everything is like an inch, inch and a half
Right.
at the biggest.
Yeah, this tooth, it was found. by Mark Pilatus, and it was in the Smoky Hill Chalk in Kansas. We were out there, and he comes up to me and with this like big smirk, and he shows me like this tooth. He found both parts of it. It was broken in half horizontally, but like the pieces matched perfectly. And it had like
Hmm.
a lot of sun bleaching too, so it would have needed to be stabilized. But the tooth, he wound up measuring it, and it was like 3 1/8 inches,
Wow.
which is like unheard of for Cretaceous rhino teeth. And you also see monstrous Cretaceous teeth too that is very underappreciated. Like there's some of those pushing 3 inches in Texas. I believe that those would have been a more sluggish shark compared to Cretaceous rhino, which is known to have been, I believe, one of the fastest, if not the fastest swimmers that we know of within the shark world.
You brought up
Do you
something
think
that I've been wondering for a hot second, and it's the idea of like Duardius cardobiodon and Cretotis competing with mosasaurs, and it makes me wonder because I think from what I understand of mosasaurs, they were at least the bigger ones were like very active predators. Whereas I suspect Duardius cardobiodon and Cretotis were probably more specialized, I would say, and less active, just based off of tooth morphology.
Well, it's hard to tell because with Cardobiodon, for example, and Duardius, you have that classic mackerel shark tooth design where they have that long principal cusp and then the lateral cusplets. So those it's hard to tell if that's what it was meant for eating or if that's just the ancestral trait of the tooth design. Because you see, while Duardius kind of got larger cusps, that probably specialized in bony fish. But
Hmm.
Cardobiodon, during the like right before their extinction, they wound up having teeth increase in size. They wound up having a reduction in their cusplets. And I've even seen some with serrations developing at the base of the principal cusp, which that thing was probably evolving to eat larger prey, such as maybe other large sharks or even mosasaurs. And I've heard reports of Cardobiodon within the Conesian, but I haven't seen anything published on that. So I've heard reports of them found in the smoky old chalk, albeit very rare. But we haven't had
Hmm.
anything published on those, so it's hard to tell whether that's actually something found there or not, because I haven't seen a tooth personally come out of there with that. But if there was something found there, that would be really interesting to see how that tooth evolved up until then, because we mostly know of them like Cardobiodon venator within the Turonian, then Cardobiodon ricci in the Cenomanian, and then that undescribed Cardobiodon within the late Albian of Australia.
Hmm.
So they could have been gearing up to compete with mosasaurs, but ultimately they weren't successful because mosasaurs lived on much longer and Cardobiodon just didn't keep up.
Hmm.
I
Mhm.
think quantifying competition is a little difficult because especially with the species where the large sharks were coexisting with the mosasaurs were pretty, I don't want to say generic, but not specialized. Because through Coniacian to Santonian times, mosasaurs, like 90%, at least in the North American record, is Tylosaurus, Quidastes, Platycarpus.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And all three of those have generalist kind of tooth morphologies. I mean, sure, Tylosaurus is the large one, and Platycarpus has more of the fish eater morphology, but I mean, it's nowhere near the specialization that you see in the late Campanian and the Maastrichtian, where you start seeing like you got Globidens with which is heavily specialized for predating on benthic shelled organisms. You've got Mosasaurus, which has these large, very sharp, cutting edge teeth. You start seeing what's the other one? You start seeing really weird specializations, which is like Xenodons. That's the one that has
Yeah,
dogfish-like teeth,
I was just about to mention that. It was such a weird looking thing.
which might have pointed towards it being at least partially a scavenger at times. What are the other weird ones out there? Allosaurines with these really recurved, specialized piscivary teeth, different from the platycarpines. The My point being, the diversity of mosasaurs in the latest part of the Cretaceous just explodes, and there you could see they're taking over realms that the sharks were previously inhabiting. But
Hmm.
competition in the early late Cretaceous, that's a little harder to say.
Yeah, and it's also possible that they were outcompeted within sharks themselves, like Cretoxyrhina, because that was a highly successful genus in the Cretaceous. I mean, spanning from the Albian all the way through to the Campanian, and Cretoxyrhina manteli was around for a long time itself. So those things could have outcompeted as well with Cardobiodon, especially when we know how, or when we hypothesize how fast Cretoxyrhina could have been.
When did it live up to? Didn't it live up to like the latest Campanian for Cretoxyrhina?
The
I
shark
think,
guy, I want to say middle campaign,
yeah,
Milo?
middle sounds about right. That's, yeah,
which is right around the same time you're seeing the emergence of the mosasaur lineages, the weird ones that appear in the late Campanian and the Maastrichtian.
yeah. And I suspect that Globidens really took off where Tychodus left off.
Yeah.
So do you think that Globidens could also have specialized in things like ammonites or sea turtles, like how they hypothesize now that Tychodus was mainly active in predating on?
So I think Globidon's predominant would have been eating stuff that's buried in the sea bottom, like what are those things called? Big plant,
Inoceramids?
yeah, inoceramids.
Yeah, those things are massive.
Yeah, those are, uh, there's some ongoing research on like using GIS and taking a look at the ranges of inoceramids and globidons, and it's pretty much 1 to 1 where inoceramids don't go beyond a certain northern latitude, and globidons stops at exactly the same position.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
I read something that maybe it was something out of the oceans of Kansas or something very similar to that, where someone had found a large inoceramic clam and it had these impressions on the top of the shell, and they were suggested to be made by a globidens. But how would you determine a globidens bite mark from a Tychodus bite mark? Their teeth morphology are quite similar to one another. So
I don't think they
that question
overlapped though,
popped in my head.
or if they did, it was just very little.
Yeah,
Mm.
because
I
what
th
the crushing
Yeah.
force of globidens is what much higher than Tychodus, I would say.
Mhm. And I know the other thing is that they find a whole bunch of those ammonites with big borings in them. And the question is that from limpets or is that from mosasaur? Like,
Mosasaur, yeah.
yeah, biting it.
hmm.
Uh, and
Most of those
what's
come
his
from
name?
Canada.
Joshua Slattery. He was working on that.
Yeah.
I was talking to him and then Neil Larson because he's got all the stuff in his collection. And what they were saying is that probably both. Limpets were causing some of those holes, and then there's a few specimens where it's got fractures that kind of pretty clearly show this thing got bit.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Although that paper's been in progress for like 10 years, so who knows when it's coming.
That does raise an interesting question because the newest paper on soft tissue Tychodus suggested that it was a more open ocean animal, a lamniform no less. and they suggest that it would have hunted ammonites and turtles, which I mean, I could believe it, but there's no evidence. Um, and that makes me wonder, I mean, if you have this correlation with globidins and inoceramids, is it just happenstance or, because it sounds like they're in two completely different niches. So it's funky.
So Lobodens is predominantly a southern mosasaur. It only stays around the equator.
Hmm.
You get it in Morocco extremely heavily. You get it throughout the southern Tethys margin, and then you get it throughout the southern parts of the Western Interior Sea. Now, when you go up to the northern parts of the Western Interior Sea, like exposures of like the very highest of the Niobrara, the Pure Shale, and the Pasquosal of Canada, you don't get globidens.
Hmm.
There's been one single globidens tooth found in Maastricht, the old chalk quarries they have there. Otherwise, it's never above a certain latitude.
You said we get
That's-
globulins in the pure shell, right?
Yes. You
Okay.
get Dakotaensis and Sukermanite. I might
Okay.
be butchering the pronunciation of that species, but yeah, you get those two.
I'm glad you mentioned that because about 2 years ago, I had bought a globidins tooth from Montana, but I had no idea where it came from. There wasn't any locality information, so it may be from the pure shale.
Hmm. Probably. Yeah, pure shell. It does have globidens. It's rare. So that's where the one famous globidens specimen that's at the Field Museum came from, pure shale.
Oh, really? Okay. You're talking about
Hmm.
the giant skull. Is that
Yeah, the
correct?
big skull
Yeah.
where they have it flipped and you could see the inside and got all the teeth that are pointing towards the viewer.
Yeah. I didn't know that came from pure shell. That's interesting.
So, what
Hmm.
are some adaptations that you think allowed mosasaurs to really explode in diversity in the late Cretaceous?
The fact they were so generalist during the early late Cretaceous.
Yeah, you
Uh,
definitely get an expansion of tooth
hmm.
sizes and shapes during that time. I mean, again, like the larger mosasaurs had much more of the larger teeth going after larger prey. So, that the growth of the teeth and also the elongations of the skull is definitely part of it.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I think it's
Mosasaurs.
mostly just because a lot of things died out. Just as
Yeah.
niches became available, the mosasaurs just started killing them.
Hmm.
And there's some things that it's not really clear what they were eating. So a good example would be there's this one species called Prognathodon curii. It's gigantic. It's about as big as some of the large Hoffman eyes, some of the large Tylosaurs. Thing would have been huge. And you look at the teeth, and they are just massive. When you look at it, the tooth is not a sharp cutting instrument. It's like a hammer, and it's kind of uncertain. Why would you need a crushing tooth that's that big? Because it's like globidens on drugs.
So, it had like a crushing morphology, not like
Yeah,
a conical like
a
Poseidon.
gigantic. Here, you know what? I got one. I'll go grab it so that there's a visual reference.
Awesome. I'm down for show and tell.
Yeah, I've got a couple of mosasaur stuff down here.
Feel free to whip
This,
them out too.
which is just
Oh,
a
that's massive.
big,
That.
huge,
See,
crushing
when
tooth.
I look at that, it reminds me of Leviathan melvillei, which is a neogene whale that it was like a sperm whale, but it was massive and it was predatory, so it or macro predatory, so it had teeth like that in the upper and lower jaws. And that thing used those teeth basically for hunting whales, large sharks, and just like crushing into them. So when I see something like that, that thing looks like it was eating other mosasaurs.
Yeah, that's an
Mosasaurs,
that's
plesiosaurs.
yeah, that's a monster tooth, Trevor.
Okay, so that's one thing to bear. Here, it's turning into show and tell with Trevor. Let me grab a few more. Uh, Give me a second.
One thing that I find crazy too, especially in the Caribbean deposits, is how diverse both the mosasaur and shark fauna is.
Ooh. Ooh, glowing in zoo.
Where is that
Stupid.
tooth from?
It's from the coffee sand of North Mississippi.
I can't even
Um,
believe
I'm not gonna shake it, but if you shake it, you can hear occasionally, or from what I've heard, a lot of the times when you get mosasaur teeth, like as they grow, they get voids in the teeth, um, below the crown, and they get filled up sometimes with calcite crystals. But you can hear that there's like a floater, like little crystal piece of calcite that bounces around in the tooth.
I think it just broke it.
It broke
Um,
what?
there's the Globidens tooth I have has what's I fairly confident is a piece of calcite that bounces around in the tooth.
Hmm.
It's real funky.
Now
Interesting.
what? Okay, here's a tangent for a tangent. What causes that calcite?
It's probably something. Oh God, it's probably something post-depositional.
Yeah,
Um,
I know it's something taphonomic. Because I asked for a. You
hmm.
see mosasaurs from like North Sulphur River and so on have that, and then uh, in one extremely rare instance, I saw a Moroccan one have it, and I picked it up. It was a Gaviella minus. It had that calcite crystallization inside it, and I was trying to figure out. It's like, why does it happen, and why is it so rare in the phosphates compared to where it's common in like the pure shale and North
Happens
Sulphur
with
River?
chalks as well a lot.
Hmm.
Um,
See, and then I started asking some of the guys on Facebook, and all I got was just this gigantic technical paper from Ken Carpenter that I never read.
that's valid. I feel that though.
I should have, but I mean, it started talking about bone appetite, and I gave up.
Hmm. Let's see some of the teeth that he brought over.
Okay, okay. So this is Nathan Curie. This is Mosasaurus Hoffmanni, and this is clearly a sharp cutting tool.
Yeah.
This one's a crushing tool. And don't let the size of these two particular specimens confuse you. Both of these species regularly got 2 inches, also in rare instances 3 inch crowns. So they
Mhm.
got gigantic. But my question is, why would this tooth ever need to evolve? Because you've got extremely huge, sharp cutting teeth like this. I mean, I think that this would be ideal for hunting marine reptiles.
yeah.
What
This
is
one
this one doing?
looks like more of an oval shaped.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that
because you could
one's
clearly
more
see
like
this one's got the hook to it.
yeah.
The
I'm
medial
thinking
curvature.
it's kind of similar to the macropredatory whales. Like that thing was
Mhm.
probably crushing down on large mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, whereas the other one was more so cutting into them. So it could have just been a different feeding tactic hunting the same prey.
So and then within the phosphates, you get a couple of these, right? So these
Mhm.
are different species. This one is Prognathodon curii. This one's Thalassotine atrox, or the old name for it was Prognathodon anceps. And
Mhm.
these two are probably the same niche too, where they're both just supermassive crushing teeth.
And why do
I
you
mean,
think that, especially in Morocco, there's such a high level of diversity for both like the mosasaurs and the sharks?
uh, it, part of it's preservational. Um, it's probably the most hunted, or one of the most hunted fossil sites in the world.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, the fossil site itself is visible from space. You could see the quarries just from satellites.
Yeah. And it's also
Ah,
one of the richest places in the
mhm.
world as far as like phosphate mines go. So
Oh yeah.
there's a lot of really well preserved fossils that can be found there. They find fossils in lots of these phosphate mines. One of the famous ones in the US being Lee Creek. And
No
they
mosasaurs in that one.
Here is a an Encodus. You probably can't see that, but damn it.
Uh,
No, you probably can't see, but that's the
yeah,
Encodus
in CODIS.
that I had saw at a rock and mineral shop.
Mhm.
And yeah, the preservation into some of that phosphate material is just absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. But even preservationally aside, in Morocco, in that area, it's still one of the richest ancient marine ecosystems that I've ever
Right.
seen. The diversity itself is astonishing, and of course, it helps
Yeah.
that the preservation is so good on them.
And the site is so extensive that you're able to have like 2,000 workers that are just all they do is fossil hunt every day.
Yeah. And one of the unfortunate consequences of that is in the fossil market, it's so diluted with fabricated specimens, specimens that are restored or repaired.
Yeah.
And and it actually can be quite difficult finding even common stuff like Ototus obliquus that is complete
Uh,
without any
Yeah.
improvements on them.
I'm able to
Yeah.
find it pretty easily, but that's just because I know all the guys that are like the primary diggers.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about if you're going to like rock shops or if you're going to like Chase and I
Yeah.
went to the Tucson Fossil Show a couple years ago. I went last year and almost all of the flats are just restored
Uh,
and repaired stuff that like vaguely resemble Ototus.
yeah, so the secondary and tertiary market that you definitely see a lot of the fabrications. But if you
Mhm.
start talking to the guys that are in the villages of like Udzem and Usofia and Gantur and so on, they all have the original stuff.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of that stuff makes its way to Europe before it makes its way here because it's a lot easier to ship that.
Unfortunate for us, fortunate for them.
I do have this tooth right here. This is actually the largest mosasaur tooth in my personal collection.
Nice.
And
So that is Thalassotite and Atrox.
the Elasmocast Natrox. Okay, I had it as Prognathodon species, but I know you're the mosasaur expert, so I'm glad I kind of
Well,
shared this.
okay, so it gets into the big question of what is Prognathodon, what is Thalassotitan?
Hmm.
Um, Thalassotitan is just, or here, a little bit of background. Prognathodon or Prognathodontan mosasaurs were a type of mosasaur. They had these big, crushing teeth, heavy enamel, uh, very thick, pronounced carinae. And if you look at their skulls and jaws, very robust.
Right.
Uh, a lot of the issues with Prognathodon stem from the fact that the type species is Prognathodon solvi, which is an extremely derived, extremely doesn't look like any of the other species. And it makes the phylogenetics just a mess. Add in the fact that a lot of these species were found during the bone wars, so the material is kind of scrappy. Um, so what's happened is Prognathodon became something of a wastebasket, where just anything that's got a tooth that's more of a crushing morphology than Mosasaurus is called Prognathodon.
Hmm.
And it's slowly been back and forth, been split up, and then like relumped. Because at least of the American species, there was what was called Gnathomortus. That was a genus that got split out of Prognathodon. And what else is there? But then you also have the lumping of certain species, like the former Lyodon species, Lyodon mosasauroides, Prognathodon
Yeah.
chianda, Arameosaurus, and a few others. And those are like, sometimes lumped into Prognathodon, and they probably shouldn't. That's a failure of modern phylogenetics.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The Bell 1997 matrix is just it's good, but it's good for the time, and it's been 20 years. And so getting to the most recent part, Thalassotitan, this one, is the super common Moroccan species that's super huge. Uh, I call it the gift shop mosasaur, and I know that annoys some of the authors that wrote about it just because it's everywhere. And I mean, it really was a gigantic, impressive mosasaur, and they like to sell it as the apex predator of the phosphates. And maybe, I mean, can you really have an apex predator be like 90% of the mosasaurs that are found?
Right.
But the getting into the taxonomy of the issue, they named it a new genus. I'm not sure if it's a new genus or not because you look at the phylogenetic tree, it's all Prognathodon, and then right in the middle you got the Lassatitan. And the argument is that Prognathodon's kind of a phylogenetic mess, so they want to provisionally make a new genus.
Hmm.
This is Corinodens. I'm not sure if it's really clear. And there haven't really been any papers on Corinodens recently. But there was an explosion in price and then an implosion in price on these things.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was, for the longest time, everybody identified these as globidens and just kind of thought, oh, it's another like $5 tooth. Nobody really paid any attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And Corinodens is a super rare Durophagus mosasaur because it's neat because it's got the teeth. This one's a matrix. It's got where globidens has that big spherical crown. Corinodens has a corn kernel where it's kind of thin.
Mm-hmm.
And the Moroccans, they didn't really identify them or think of them anything special. And then it was around 2020, 2021
Mm-hmm.
that I started telling them, hey, these things are like super valuable. And I told like the three people that handle exports the most,
Mm-hmm.
and suddenly the whole phosphates figured it out.
So if anybody overpays for one of those, they can thank you for it.
Anybody that overpaid in the 2021 to 2022 range, because there was a time when they were like $500 a piece.
And they would sell
Oh,
for that?
wow.
Oh yeah. And then, but what happened is, as they knew how to identify them, more and more were found. There's not that
Mhm.
many collectors are looking for them, so the
Yeah.
price went from like you could buy it for the price of a globe, and it's $5 up to 500, and now it's kind of come back down to about 50, and I think that's about right.
hmm Yeah, one of the sharks that you see that massive price increase for since a publication would have been Megalolomna because
Mhm.
those were described in like 2016 and that really put them on the radar. And to be fair, they're super rare teeth, and the fact that they're related to Megalodon really helps out their price.
Mhm.
But those things sell for an obscene amount of money. I mean,
Right, the
I've
other one
found
that
them for a lot of money.
another one that had that crazy price hike, and then well, it actually never dropped. Hoffmanite. Hoffmanite's president of the phosphates. It's really easy to misidentify with the other species, Baugi.
hmm
Just they look extremely similar, and unless you've got the two teeth next to each other and you're able to do like facet counts,
hmm
they're hard to tell apart.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
what happened? I did a publication on them January of 2020 that finally added them to the phosphates. The collectors knew that they were in the phosphates. I mean, you could see fossil form posts about it going back like 5, 10 years. But it finally got recognized around 2020. And it was like between that, and I sent that paper to all the Moroccan dealers too, of course. And then that same month, no, like a month later, Prehistoric Planet came out, the first one.
hmm
And they have this whole sequence on, oh, this is Hoffman's Mosasaur, the biggest, scariest. Here's this whole scene with it and it fighting and so on.
hmm
And the demand just
Yeah.
went nuts.
And to be fair with that too, if those things are selling for those prices, then that means that that's what it's worth because people are willing to throw
Mhm.
that type of money in at them. Like for example, with my Megalolomna tooth, the most expensive Megalolomna tooth I've sold, I didn't even want to sell it. So one, I
Mhm.
bought it for a lot of money, but two, the person that wanted to buy it, they just kept throwing money offers and money offers and money offers. And
Oh
it
my.
just got higher and higher and higher. And then eventually I caved in and sold it to the guy. But if people are willing to throw that type of money at something, then that's its value.
I think
As long
Hoffman
as it,
has his. Oh, go ahead, Chase.
as long as it's not, I was gonna make a joke. As long as it's not BlackRock out here buying up our fossil real
Precious
estate.
fossils.
Yeah, to rent out to people. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Hoffman has a little bit historical and cultural importance too, just because for a lot of European countries, Hoffman was one of the first vertebrate skulls ever found.
Hmm.
Because they found the first one in the mines at Maastricht.
Hmm.
The first two skulls they were found there, and they were really foundational to the discovery of like the concepts of extinction and evolution, and that the fact that species can exist and then stop existing, that you could have something that resembles this gigantic monitor lizard that existed, but it existed millions of years ago. And it's something of a symbol of national pride, at least in both Belgium and the Netherlands. Uh, and especially for the holotype specimen, because that one was it's actually kind of contentious. That skull was seized by Napoleon's army way back when, and
Right.
that's why it's in France. So the French have a little bit of a claim to it too, and it's a fairly uh, geographically diverse species too. So you find it all throughout the eastern United States, and you can find it in northern North Africa. You find bits and pieces here and there and everywhere. And because of that, there's a lot of people that it's really high in demand just because it's got so much story to it too.
Hmm. Yeah, Mosasaurus hoffmanni is kind of like the T-Rex of the seas.
Oh yeah,
Especially when it was in Jurassic World too, right?
yeah, they call it hop. Yeah, I think
They
Jurassic
call
World
it it. I
they
mean,
call it
obviously it's not
Maximus,
scientific.
Mosasaurus Maximus.
Wait, what?
Hmm.
Two Maximus.
Yeah, Jurassic World they call it Mosasaurus Maximus,
Ah,
Ooh, interesting.
so I
which
was under the impression it was a hoffmanni, but
Hmm.
well,
yeah.
I don't think they actually knew that there was a species called Maximus. I think they just thought Maximus was a cool name. And it just kind of happened that Maximus is a synonym of Hoffmanni, depending on who you ask.
That's a really interesting like irony, a little bit. Hmm.
I don't
So
know. Most of our researchers can't agree on what the type species is. There's so much like, oh, is this Hoffmanni or is it a synonym or should it be split?
mhm.
Should
I'm not
Lahoneri be
convinced.
considered a juvenile Hoffmanni? Is Balgii the same? How do you spell Hoffmanni? I swear I got peer review comments. Two leading mosasaur researchers spell Hoffmanni differently, and they're having a proxy war in my peer review comments.
In the shark world, in the Cretaceous, we have something similar with Cretaulomna versus Cretalomna. I tend to
It's
side on the Cretalomna.
Cretolambda.
What?
Severson's wrong. It's spelled with an O, not an A.
I think you're wrong. I'll
Yeah,
go with Cyverson on that.
I have to agree with Ben here because I see the
Uh,
A all the
it,
time.
okay, it depends on how you define what's the term? Like prevalent usage or something.
Yeah, so Cretalomna was the initial spelling of it. And then
Yeah.
people just started using, I believe initially as a typo, Cretalomna, and that was used
Mhm.
predominantly until around the time of the Cyverson publication, where he published on all these different Cretaceous age Cretalomna species. And he makes the argument that it follows validity that the first spelling of it, Cretalomna, should override the common usage of Cretalomna. So that's why he believes it should have the A. And I think that that logic makes sense to me. So I stick with the credit.
Prevailing usage up until 2000 was everybody used Credo Lambda. And I thought it
Yeah.
was even Glickman himself said that it was a typographical error.
But I believe it was the first spelling being Cretalomna. So that's why, since it was the first one, we
Did,
kind of
did,
had
did
to
you read
go.
the ICZN movement that Capetta wrote?
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people are really invested in this.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I'm
because
still on Team Cretalamna.
no, because like he wrote this really impassioned thing, and it was so moving. They actually introduced a whole new rule to the code, and it's screwing things up because that rule affects mosasaurs.
Mm,
Mhm.
Rest in peace, Capetta.
Yeah.
Rest in peace. Mercy.
Now
I,
I
I
have a
want to bring
question.
I want to bring back Cretel.
What?
I want to bring back Cretel. I'm gonna make the argument that Cretel with an A is not prevailing usage. It's only prevailing in academic circles, and 99% of collectors and museum labels and so on still spell with an O. And
Yeah,
everything in the published literature up until 2000 uses an O.
And
but
on
the thing is,
Tyrannus alert.
99% of collectors and everyone else call every Cretalamna Cretalamna appendiculata. So
Don't bring that point up.
that entire name is largely a waste bucket. So I don't think we can really go based on the collector market for that as far as coming up with the valid scientific name. And then still nowadays, after that publication, people are using Cretalamna in publications. So now that's the prevailing name.
Look, it
You
could be
can make the
worse.
argument that it's changed. What?
It could be worse. It could be Nanotyrannus.
Oh God, don't you're gonna bring dinosaur people to this. Don't do
pick,
that.
I'm
pick
telling you,
your
I need to
battles.
get a
Pick
dinosaur
your
person
battles.
on this so we can talk about Nanotyrannus.
Pick your battles wisely.
I,
Dinosaur
I've got
people are
opinions on Nanotyrannus.
Let's hear him.
We all have opinions on
Um,
Nanotyrannus.
I don't want to be here another 2 hours talking about it.
You have opinions, you just don't want to share them.
I mean, this is a shark podcast, right?
Well, Gentlemen of the Corax expands beyond the realm of just sharks. As long as
I,
sharks are included.
I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot of fossil material that kind of points one direction, and then there's like the overwhelming opinion that kind of is a different direction. I don't know how much I want to go with this.
I mean, what you got that specimen in North Carolina right now with the dueling dinosaurs.
Okay, let's go. Okay, yeah. There's the dueling dinosaur specimen, the Bloody Mary specimen that Lindsay Zano and James Napoli and so on. They paid what was it, $6 million or $9 million just so they could call Tom Carr wrong. Paleontological rivalries are nuts.
Yeah, it's nasty.
Yeah, no. So like, without saying the conclusions from the paper that they have in press, I'll just say that they invited Pete Larson and Clayton Phipps and all the collector guys to their big unveiling ceremony, and that kind of tells you the direction that they're thinking.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, I don't know. I mean, getting back to the fossils itself, I mean, there's the whole argument, which is, does it fit or does it not fit onto the growth curve? Tom Carr's position has always been that for Nanotyrannus, it does fit on the growth curve because there's small T-Rex, and then it goes through growth spurt, and then it has an arrest, then it has another growth spurt, and then another arrest. And it's this crazy bending of a typical growth curve in order to make it all fit.
Hmm.
And then there was last year's Longridge paper, which was just a whole bunch of like random but valid characters that point towards perhaps these two are different. Uh,
You had the Hollywood word paper too.
yeah, that's the other one. They're using histology. I don't like using histology to diagnose species. They did that with Globin and Simplex. What do bone rings have on species validity? Uh, let's not get too into Nanotyrannus because we could start talking about
There's gonna be a
Emerson's
giant
original book.
fight in our comment section.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna invite all this anger now.
Here,
Look,
I mean,
you
dude,
can
lead us.
tell
dinosaur
them I brought it
people
up.
dinosaur people scare me, man. I mean, apparently at SVP last year, I didn't see it. I didn't know about it until recently. There was an actual like shouting match fight between
Hmm?
dinosaur researchers like in the like talk
Huh?
sessions of SVP.
I
Really?
forget
I
which.
mean,
So I think
I'm
there were
not
two of them,
surprised, but
They're
like
different breed
no,
than
yeah.
us.
and of course it's the Tyrannosaur guys.
Oh, yeah.
I doubt you'll ever see invert guys having shouting matches at talks.
No,
no.
never.
They're like, while I
You-
disagree, you are
you-
still an amazing person for loving invertebrates, as
yeah.
opposed to go die in a hole, you nanotyrannus supporting
Wait, what was
bad
that fight
word.
over Nanotyrannus or was it over?
It
I
was
thought it was
over
the
something.
Displetosaurus
No, I think it was
anagenesis thing.
No, I think it was Spinosaurus. Was it Spinosaurus?
That adds up.
Which one? The
Spinosaurus debates are
SVP?
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you
No,
had a
but the
lot of
spot.
people in there in that same room, kind of
I don't
But
remember.
going after
the
It
Spinosaurus.
was
Spinosaurus guys are
something
pretty
really
calm.
stupid. I could text somebody who knows the
Yeah.
situation.
Because I think what's going on with Spinosaurus is just you got Ibrahim and Sereno. They're just citing each other 1,000 times back and forth. Oh, does Spinosaurus live on land or in water? It's a crocodile-looking thing. There's no chance it was in both.
Yeah, I get tired of the Spinosaurus publications coming out every other week, all trying to contradict each other.
They don't say anything new. There's, there's no new fossil material. Very little new analysis. It's all just like meta review.
Hmm.
I remember reading a paper on about who wrote that paper? Cristiano Del Sasso wrote a paper about like finding a tail fluke on Spinosaurus with the elongated vertebrae, called a
Hmm?
vertebrae. And then I think that's the last paper that I read on it, considering that it was probably in water because of those called vertebrae. But I mean,
Well, because I think people go back and forth over, well, could that tail be used for propulsion or not, or was it just kind
right?
of decorative?
Hmm.
And you got people that are
Yes.
thin sectioning the bones, being like, "Oh, it's this dense, so it means this."
Lots of
Yeah.
guessing in vertebrate paleontology.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Here,
I'm
I
sick of
got a
it.
topic to go back on track with the
Sure.
sharks and mosasaurs. So we
Get back
see
on topic.
So we see bones of mosasaurs, I believe, what was it, from Kansas with Cretoxyrhina marks
Yeah,
on it, showing that Cretoxyrhina predated on mosasaurs. Do we
yes,
find any evidence of mosasaurs predating on sharks? I
No,
mean, clearly they would have done this,
yeah.
but have we found any concrete evidence on it?
I think we found a few that have them in gut contents. I cannot, for the life of me, recall the exact specimen. So I know there's definitely a Mosasaurus missouriensis specimen that was found in Canada. It's the Mr. Sinister specimen. And that one definitely had a whole bunch of fish inside of it. And there were shark teeth, like swallow Corax, littered all around it.
Hmm.
mm,
But that's not necessarily showing that the mosasaur ate the shark. I know they found there was a Prognathodon Kianda from Angola, and that had three separate mosasaurs inside of it.
Wow.
That's actually a really amazing specimen. So you got a Prognathodon Kianda, and then inside of it you got another Kianda and a Gavialamimus and another third thing that they called a new species.
oh
Hmm.
wow.
I don't know. That diagnosing a new species off of like a half digested bone.
So,
But
so
never mind that.
mosasaurs
Yeah.
could swallow things much larger than a lot of other animals due to their jaw structure, correct?
I don't know that they swallowed the whole thing whole, but at least big chunks.
Yeah.
In that particular one, it wasn't even a big Bergnathonkion. It was like an average sized one.
Hmm. Wow.
As far as their ability to swallow, there's a whole lot of talk about cranial kinesis and the jaw kinetics. Did they have like jaws like snakes where they could kind of
Mhm.
unhinge? And the general view of the skulls is that the earlier species were more kinetic,
Hmm.
and you have increased uh, akinesis the more derived you get. So
Hmm.
things like the early tylosaurs and the early like basal Clydastes, platycarpus sort of things, those had more kinetic skulls that could have accompanied swallowing more
Hmm.
than things like Prognathodon and Mosasaurus and Lobodens and Perinodons.
Yeah, and that makes sense because those larger mosasaurs by the end of their reign, they would have been hunting prey that would have been much, much larger and would have taken upon, instead of feeding on like fish that they could swallow, they're looking
Mm.
for power and be able to take down like large elasmosaurs or something like that, where they're really
Mm.
just like tearing chunks out.
Oh, they found a Elasmosaur with a Mosasaur inside of it. Where
Really?
was that? Yeah,
Really?
where was that found? Kansas or the Dakotas? I don't remember.
With that small head?
Yeah,
I
I mean, it wasn't a big one. Uh,
That is something I can't
I,
fathom.
I
It must have
forget the,
scavenged it.
yeah,
I can't
I don't,
imagine.
it wasn't a big mosasaur, and I forget the name of the species. They found it. The reason I remember it is because there was an argument over what was the type of mosasaur that was preserved inside.
Hmm.
Because Everhart was saying it has to be Plioplatycarpine because there's no Clydastes found in the pure shale. Oh, pure shale. That's where it was found. Um,
So
but
was it
then
Styxosaurus? The Elasmosaur was maybe Styxosaurus?
probably that sounds right. But then shortly afterwards, they found Clydastes in the pure shale. Or Clydastes like mosasaur.
Hmm.
So I, I haven't seen the specimen. I can't recall exactly what they were, but yeah, it was from the pure shell.
I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the one that was discovered in Hell Creek not too
Oh, that's
long
a
ago.
prognathodon.
That was a Prognathodon as well?
Oh, it's an undiagnostic mosasaur, but in private collections, there's specimens of prognathodon. So, but we're not allowed to look at private specimens.
Yeah, that's another conversation for another day.
That's another freaking hour and a half talk
All
right
right.
there.
Yeah, so Hell Creek has prognathodon in it, but n nobody acknowledges it because some of the key specimens are not publicly available.
Hmm.
But the paper that came out was Van Vraken and Boyd, 2019, I want to say. What they found, it was like a splenial and the syringular complex of a mosasaurine, which is not diagnostic because like the syringular complex is kind of identical in Mosasaurus and Prognathodon and a few of the other big ones.
Hmm.
But
So,
like there's clearly teeth that are Prognathodon.
yeah. So as we're going towards the Maastrichtian, what do you think eventually caused the demise of mosasaurs and what led sharks to essentially like survive this mass
Big space
extinction?
rock. Big space rock.
Yeah, big ass space rock.
Uh, when you're super huge and you're highly diversified, a sudden reduction in the amount of energy and the food source in your environment can be catastrophic.
Hmm.
So mosasaurs were able to diversify so much because they were kind of small and generic early on throughout like the Cenomanian times, and then even the Coniacian Santonian, they weren't super diversified and they weren't gigantic.
Hmm.
But then towards the Maastrichtian, you got highly specialized, extremely large forms that when their ecosystem collapses, they die out too. Meanwhile, there were small sharks. Perfect example is Cretolama,
Blasphemy.
that wasn't that big, that was perfectly sized and perfectly generalist to
Hmm.
take over and survive the asteroid extinction.
Yeah. Sharks really do have a miraculous ability to survive mass extinctions. I mean, you see them as far as the true sharks, they survived the Triassic one and like bounce back with amazing radiations of diversity. And with the Cretaceous one, I mean, you didn't really have those massive macropredatory sharks at that time, like Cretaxurina. So you had things like Cretalamna, which were very well suited generalists, especially when they have teeth meant for eating fish. And then when all of the marine reptiles go away, what's left are sharks, fish, things like that. So they're able to still survive in their niche. They're not massive, so they don't require um the same amounts of energy they need to consume, like something like a megalodon, for example, would. So they would be, far more susceptible to extinction. And for the most part, when you specialize, that's great for when your environment stays consistent. But when there's changes in that, that's when you see big issues that species face because they need to adapt when they're so used to adapting for something else.
Hmm. I do wonder, um, because I've heard rumors of mosasaurs at least surviving the KPG at least for a little bit, and one of my friends in the Basal Clayton formation of Mississippi just recently found a ammonite, Sphenodiscus, it's the ammonite, and it was infilled with Clayton formation. The chambers were infilled with Clayton, so that animal survived the KPG and lived long enough to be filled up with Clayton formation. So makes you wonder what all limped into the Paleocene and then went but ammonites definitely limp into the Clayton and then die. I think. I mean, it to an extent. I mean,
Like a
looking at the
few million.
specimen that Kendall found, my buddy Kendall. I mean, it is straight up in the living chambers, or not in the living. I don't recall in the outer chambers of the animal. It was straight up Clayton. So
So I know for mosasaurs, there have been a couple instances of rework specimens. I have not found anything that is in the layer itself. Because in Poland and then in Italy, you'll get reworked bits and pieces. That's almost definitely Maastrichtian of age originally, but it's occurring in the Paleocene layer.
Hmm.
a lot of the Paleocene localities, especially in the southeast of the United States, get a little funky just because got hit by a mega tsunami. Which makes me think, there's a non-zero likelihood that a Mosasaurus hoffmanni shredded on a giant wave to its death, a last hoorah. I have a feeling that happened.
Gotta go find it.
Surfboard. Yeah,
Hey
man. You need a
guys,
surfboard.
I may have to leave here. I got company coming over.
That's
Uh,
So
okay.
well,
I think
hey,
we're
it was
about,
great talking.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least we made it through till the mosasaur extinction. So now sharks versus mosasaurs, sharks actually do win.
I mean, good
shut
luck
and
titling this video.
Mosasaurs
We
live
talked about
on
so much.
in the hearts and minds of Americans.
Hmm.
Only Americans, though. Just kidding.
It's okay. You
ah,
can still find mosasaurs today in gift shops and all of that.
Hmm.
yeah,
Every gift shop. Fossil number
literally,
one.
and from Morocco of all places. I had to really hunt down some Mosasaurus fossils from North America. It took me a while to get one in
It's
my backyard.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I still have not found mine yet.
Lame. Just
I
kidding.
suspect I'll have a very hard time finding one here in central Arizona.
Probably. I have a
Yeah.
suspicion you
Well,
might be correct.
wait, Arizona?
Yeah.
I'm
I'm
gonna
sure
find
that they'd
something.
be up north.
Th- There is, I forget if it was Arizona or New Mexico. There is like a tiny little patch of Cretaceous sea that you can find mosasaurs in.
Hmm. Yeah,
I need to find the reference for that.
there's the Adarkey Formation that's up north that I've checked out before.
Yeah.
And then there's also the Black Mesa area, which has, I believe, Cenomanian, so they find like pliosaurs and stuff like that there.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you
It
gonna
was a
get going?
great discussion. I look forward to the next one. Let us know in the comments what you guys think, sharks versus mosasaurs. And be sure to subscribe to Elasmocast so you don't miss another epic conversation like this one.
Make sure to comment Creta Alumna to spite Trevor.
Do it.
Yeah. Do it.
Cretalana.
Cretalata.
I am gonna write something to the ICCN.
Oh
Do
God,
it. No
not
balls. Well,
again. They're gonna be like, this is back.
All
No.
right. See you
all right,
guys
take
later.
care.